April 12, 1986 was a Saturday like any other in the suburb of Evanston, Illinois, with families running errands, children playing in yards, and the community enjoying the mild spring weather that had finally arrived after a long winter. The Harrison family lived in a two-story colonial house on Maple Avenue, a quiet residential street with sidewalks lined with oak trees and neighbors who'd known each other for years. Emma Harrison was 6 years old that Saturday morning, a girl with long blonde hair usually tied in a ponytail, blue eyes, a constellation of freckles across her nose, and an independent spirit that her parents both admired and worried about. She wore pink corduroy overalls over a white long-sleeved shirt, white sneakers with pink laces she'd chosen herself, and she carried a small purple backpack shaped like a butterfly that held her favorite stuffed rabbit. Emma had been playing in the front yard with her older brother Josh, who was 10, building a fort from cardboard boxes their father had brought home from work, while their mother Sarah watched from the living room window. At 10:30 a.m. the telephone rang, and Sarah stepped away from the window to answer it, speaking with her mother about plans for Easter dinner the following weekend, a conversation she expected to last just a few minutes. Josh had gone inside to use the bathroom at 10:32 a.m., leaving Emma alone in the front yard with the cardboard boxes, though Sarah could see her daughter from the window once she returned from answering the phone. But Sarah's mother was upset about a family conflict, and the conversation stretched to nearly 15 minutes as Sarah tried to calm her down while standing in the kitchen rather than returning to the living room window. At 10:47 a.m., Sarah ended the call and walked back to the living room window expecting to see Emma still playing with the cardboard fort, but her daughter was no longer visible in the front yard. Sarah called for Emma and stepped onto the front porch, thinking her daughter had moved to the side yard or gone to a neighbor's house despite being told to stay in front where she could be seen. But Emma didn't respond, and when Sarah walked around the house checking the backyard and side areas, there was no sign of her 6-year-old daughter anywhere on the property. Josh came outside and confirmed he'd left Emma in the front yard with the boxes about 15 minutes earlier, and he'd assumed she was still there when he'd been upstairs in the bathroom. By 10:50 a.m., Sarah was walking up and down Maple Avenue calling Emma's name and asking neighbors if they'd seen her daughter, and several people joined the search, checking their own yards and garages. One neighbor mentioned seeing a white van parked on the street around 10:35 a.m., unusual because most residents parked in driveways, but she hadn't paid close attention and couldn't describe the vehicle beyond its color. Sarah called her husband David at 10:55 a.m., and he left work immediately, and Sarah also called Evanston police to report that her 6-year-old daughter had disappeared from their front yard. In approximately 15 minutes, while her mother talked on the phone in the kitchen and her brother used the bathroom inside, 6-year-old Emma Harrison vanished from a residential front yard in broad daylight. If you want to hear what really happened to Emma and how this ordinary day changed the Harrison family forever, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue. Evanston police arrived at 11:05 a.m., and Officer Michael Santos immediately organized a search of the neighborhood while obtaining descriptions of Emma and what she'd been wearing. The purple butterfly backpack Emma had been carrying became a key identifying feature, along with the pink corduroy overalls and blonde ponytail that multiple neighbors confirmed they'd seen earlier that morning. The cardboard boxes Emma had been playing with were still in the front yard exactly where she'd left them, and investigators examined the area for any evidence of struggle or signs of where Emma had gone. The quiet suburban street seemed an unlikely place for an abduction in broad daylight, but the complete absence of Emma despite dozens of people searching suggested she hadn't simply wandered away on her own. David arrived home at 11:15 a.m. to find police cars on his street, and neighbors gathered on sidewalks, and Sarah was hysterical, explaining that Emma had disappeared while she'd been on the phone for just 15 minutes. The white van that had been seen parked on Maple Avenue became the initial focus of investigation, though with only a color and no other details. Tracking such a common vehicle seemed nearly impossible. By noon, over 50 police officers and volunteers were searching Evanston, checking every yard, garage, shed, and business within a mile radius of the Harrison home, calling Emma's name and showing her photo to anyone they encountered. Bloodhounds arrived from Chicago by 12:30 p.m., and the dogs were given Emma's scent from her bedroom, and they tracked from the front yard where she'd been playing toward the sidewalk and then to the street. The bloodhounds followed a scent trail along Maple Avenue for approximately 2 blocks before losing it completely near the intersection with Oak Street, suggesting Emma had been placed in a vehicle at that location. This discovery supported the theory that the white van had been involved, and investigators focused on identifying anyone who owned or had access to such a vehicle in the Evanston area. Detective Robert Chen arrived at 1:00 p.m. and immediately began interviewing neighbors about what they'd seen and heard between 10:30 and 11:00 a.m., trying to piece together a timeline of events. Several residents recalled seeing Emma playing in the front yard earlier that morning, and a few mentioned noticing the white van parked on the street, but nobody had seen Emma get into any vehicle or noticed anything suspicious. One elderly man who'd been gardening mentioned that he'd heard a child's voice around 10:40 a.m., possibly saying, "Okay," or agreeing to something, but he hadn't looked up and couldn't provide more details. This vague recollection suggested someone might have spoken to Emma, possibly convincing her to walk to their vehicle, and that she'd gone willingly without screaming or showing distress. FBI was contacted by 2:00 p.m., given the potential for child abduction, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Chicago field office with resources and experience from similar cases. Agent Wells interviewed Sarah extensively about the 15-minute phone call, and whether Emma would have left the yard voluntarily to go with someone, and Sarah insisted her daughter knew not to talk to strangers. "Emma is cautious and follows rules," Sarah said through tears. She wouldn't have gotten into a car with someone she didn't know, unless they told her something that made her think it was safe, or that we'd sent them. This suggestion led investigators to consider that the abductor might have used a ruse, claiming to be sent by Sarah or David, or saying there was an emergency that required Emma to come with them. By afternoon, the case had become major news across Illinois, with Emma's photo appearing on television and in newspapers, her blonde ponytail and purple butterfly backpack becoming images that thousands of people recognized. Tips began flooding in from people who claimed to have seen white vans or girls matching Emma's description, but each lead was investigated and found to be either mistaken identity or unrelated to the case. The Harrison family appeared on local news at 5 p.m., pleading for Emma's return, and Sarah spoke directly to whoever had taken her daughter, begging them to let her come home safely. "Emma is only 6 years old," Sarah sobbed. "She's probably scared and wants her family. If someone has her, please let her go. Please don't hurt her. We just want our baby back." David sat beside Sarah, barely able to speak, and Josh stood with his parents looking traumatized, and the image of the devastated family was broadcast across the region. By evening, Detective Chen had compiled a list of registered sex offenders living in Evanston and surrounding communities, and each person was located and interviewed about their whereabouts on Saturday morning. One name that raised concerns was Martin Ellis, a 42-year-old man who lived alone 3 blocks from the Harrison home, and who'd been convicted of child molestation in 1978. Ellis had served 5 years in prison and had been released in 1983 with registration requirements, and he worked as a maintenance contractor driving a van for his business. When investigators visited Ellis's home at 7 p.m., they found he owned a white Dodge van matching the general description of the vehicle seen on Maple Avenue that morning. Ellis claimed he'd been home all morning working on paperwork and hadn't left his house or driven anywhere, but his alibi was vague and couldn't be verified by witnesses. Detective Chen obtained a warrant to search Ellis's home and van, and forensic teams arrived to process both locations looking for any evidence connecting him to Emma's disappearance. The van was examined thoroughly, and technicians found several blonde hairs on the floor in the cargo area, though testing would be needed to determine if they matched Emma. By Sunday morning, forensic analysis of the blonde hairs found in Martin Ellis's van was underway, and investigators waited anxiously for results that could either eliminate or implicate him in Emma's abduction. Ellis was brought to the Evanston police station for formal questioning, and he maintained that he hadn't left his home on Saturday morning and had no knowledge of Emma Harrison's disappearance. Detective Chen pressed Ellis about the white van seen on Maple Avenue, and Ellis insisted that while he owned such a vehicle, he hadn't driven it on Saturday, and it had been parked in his driveway all day. But neighbors who lived near Ellis were interviewed, and one recalled seeing Ellis's van leaving his driveway around 10:15 a.m. Saturday, contradicting his claim that he'd been home all morning. When confronted with this information, Ellis became defensive and changed his story, saying he'd forgotten that he'd driven briefly to a hardware store, but had returned within 20 minutes. The hardware store was checked, and employees had no record of Ellis making purchases that morning, and security footage didn't show him in the store during the time frame he claimed. These inconsistencies and lies made Ellis the primary suspect, and investigators applied pressure hoping he would confess or reveal where Emma was being held. But Ellis refused to answer further questions without an attorney, and by Sunday afternoon he'd retained legal representation and stopped cooperating with the investigation entirely. The blonde hairs from his van were sent for expedited DNA analysis, though in 1986 such testing was relatively new and took longer than it would in later decades. While waiting for forensic results, Detective Chen organized searches of areas where Ellis was known to frequent, including properties he'd worked on as a maintenance contractor and locations he'd visited regularly. One property that raised concern was an abandoned warehouse in the industrial area of Evanston, where Ellis had done work 6 months earlier, and search teams descended on the location Sunday evening. The warehouse was dark and filled with debris, and officers searched every room and storage area calling Emma's name and looking for any sign she'd been held there. In a back office on the second floor, investigators found a purple butterfly backpack partially hidden under a pile of old newspapers, and inside was a stuffed rabbit that matched the description of Emma's favorite toy. This discovery confirmed that Emma had been in the warehouse at some point, and the building was immediately secured as a crime scene while forensic teams processed every surface for evidence. But despite extensive searching, Emma herself was not found in the warehouse, and investigators feared she'd been moved to another location, or that something worse had occurred. Ellis was arrested Sunday night and charged with child abduction based on the backpack found in the warehouse where he'd previously worked, though he continued to deny any involvement. "I don't know how that backpack got there," Ellis insisted. "I haven't been to that warehouse in months. Someone is setting me up. I didn't take that little girl." But the evidence was mounting against him. The white van matching witness descriptions, the lies about his whereabouts, the blonde hairs in his vehicle, and now Emma's backpack found in a building connected to him. The Harrison family was informed about the backpack discovery, and while it provided some answers about where Emma had been, it also deepened their fear about what had happened to her. By Monday, the case had become national news, featured on network television and in newspapers across the country, with Emma's photo appearing alongside images of Martin Ellis and the warehouse where her backpack was found. Pressure mounted on Ellis to reveal where Emma was, and prosecutors offered reduced charges if he would cooperate and lead investigators to her. But he maintained his innocence and refused all deals. DNA results from the blonde hairs came back Wednesday, and they showed a match to Emma Harrison with 99.8% certainty, providing conclusive evidence that she'd been in Ellis's van. With this forensic proof, prosecutors charged Ellis with kidnapping, and he was held without bail while the search for Emma continued with increasing desperation. Detective Chen believed Ellis had moved Emma from the warehouse to another location, possibly after realizing investigators were focusing on him, and that finding her required breaking through his denials. Psychologists were brought in to develop interrogation strategies, and Ellis was questioned repeatedly about what he'd done with Emma and where she could be found. But Ellis remained silent or repeated his denials, and as days passed without finding Emma, investigators feared the worst about her fate. By late April, 2 weeks after Emma's disappearance, the intensive daily searches had been scaled back, though investigators continued pursuing leads, and Ellis remained in custody, refusing to cooperate. The Harrison family was living in agony, knowing that Ellis likely had information about Emma's whereabouts but being powerless to force him to reveal the truth. Sarah had stopped sleeping and eating properly, and David had taken leave from work to focus entirely on the search, and Josh was being counseled for trauma related to his sister's abduction. On April 28th, a maintenance worker cleaning debris from a drainage culvert in a wooded area 5 miles from Evanston made a horrific discovery that would devastate the Harrison family. Partially concealed in the culvert was the body of a small child wearing pink corduroy overalls and white sneakers, and the worker immediately contacted police. Detective Chen arrived at the scene within 30 minutes, and while formal identification was pending, the clothing matched what Emma Harrison had been wearing on April 12th. The body was carefully recovered and transported to the medical examiner's office, and dental records confirmed what everyone feared. The remains were Emma Harrison. The medical examiner determined that Emma had died from asphyxiation, likely within hours of being abducted, and that her body had been placed in the culvert shortly after her death. This timeline meant that while the Harrison family and hundreds of searchers had been desperately looking for Emma, she'd already been deceased, hidden in a drainage pipe in a remote wooded area. Detective Chen and Agent Wells delivered the devastating news to Sarah and David on April 29th, and the parents collapsed in grief upon learning their daughter had been found, but would never come home alive. "We kept hoping she was being held somewhere and would be rescued," Sarah said through uncontrollable sobs, "and now we know she died that same day, probably while we were still searching the neighborhood." The discovery of Emma's body intensified the case against Martin Ellis, and prosecutors now charged him with first-degree murder, in addition to kidnapping. Evidence suggested Ellis had taken Emma from Maple Avenue in his van, had driven her to the abandoned warehouse where he'd assaulted and killed her, then had disposed of her body in the culvert. The purple butterfly backpack had been left at the warehouse, possibly discarded accidentally when Ellis moved Emma's body, creating the evidence that had led to his arrest. Ellis continued to maintain his innocence even when confronted with Emma's death, claiming he'd been framed and that someone else had used his van and the warehouse to commit the crime. But forensic evidence was overwhelming. Emma's DNA in his van, her backpack in a building he'd worked in, and fiber evidence connecting his van to the clothing Emma had been wearing. Ellis's trial began in September 1986, and prosecutors presented a timeline showing how he'd abducted Emma during the brief window when she was alone in her front yard. Witnesses testified about seeing the white van on Maple Avenue, and the neighbor who'd heard a child's voice saying "okay" testified about the timing matching when Ellis would have approached Emma. The prosecution's theory was that Ellis had been driving through the neighborhood, had seen Emma alone, and had convinced her to come to his van by claiming her mother had sent him or that there was an emergency. Emma, trusting what she'd been told, had walked to the van and gotten inside, and Ellis had driven to the warehouse where he'd killed her, then had disposed of her body in the remote culvert. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Ellis's van could have been used by someone else, but the DNA evidence and timeline were too strong to overcome. On November 14, 1986, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Martin Ellis guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping, and he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The Harrison family attended the sentencing hearing, and Sarah read a victim impact statement describing how Ellis had destroyed their family and stolen Emma's future. "Emma was 6 years old and had her whole life ahead of her," Sarah said. "She should have grown up, gone to school, made friends, had a family of her own, but Martin Ellis took all of that away in one terrible day." Emma was buried in May 1986 in a cemetery near her home, and over 500 people attended the funeral to honor the little girl whose life had been stolen by a predator who'd been watching and waiting for an opportunity. The years following Emma's death were devastating for the Harrison family, with Sarah, David, and Josh each struggling to process the trauma and grief that defined their lives after April 12, 1986. Sarah was consumed by guilt over the 15-minute phone call that had distracted her from watching Emma, and despite therapy and support from family, she never fully forgave herself. 15 minutes, Sarah would say repeatedly. "If I'd just told my mother I'd call her back, if I'd stayed at the window, Emma would still be here, and I have to live with that forever." David tried to be strong for his family, but he struggled with rage toward Martin Ellis and the knowledge that a registered sex offender had been living 3 blocks away without their knowledge. Josh, who'd been 10 when Emma was taken, grew up carrying guilt that he'd left her alone to use the bathroom, and he required years of counseling to understand that he'd been a child and bore no responsibility. The Harrison family became advocates for stricter laws regarding sex offender registration and community notification, working to ensure neighbors knew when dangerous individuals lived nearby. Sarah testified before the Illinois legislature in 1987, sharing Emma's story and pushing for laws that would require active notification rather than passive registration that most families never checked. "We had a right to know that a convicted child molester lived on our street," Sarah told lawmakers. "And if we'd known, we would have been more vigilant. We would have watched Emma differently, and she might still be alive." Illinois passed comprehensive sex offender notification laws in 1988, requiring law enforcement to proactively inform communities when registered offenders moved into neighborhoods, reforms known as Emma's Law. The Harrison family also established the Emma Harrison Foundation, supporting programs that taught children about stranger danger and helping families of murdered children navigate the justice system and grief. David died in 2003 at age 59 from a heart attack, and those who knew him believed the 17 years of carrying grief and trauma had contributed to his early death. Sarah continued the foundation's work and spoke publicly about Emma's case, appearing at conferences and events to share their family's story and advocate for child safety legislation. Josh became a criminal prosecutor as an adult, dedicating his career to seeking justice for victims, and he told colleagues that Emma's death had shaped his entire life's trajectory. "I became a prosecutor because of what happened to my sister," Josh explained. "And every case I work, every victim I fight for, is in some way connected to Emma and wanting to prevent other families from experiencing what we went through." Martin Ellis remained in prison, and he never confessed to killing Emma or showed remorse for his crime, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence even decades later. He died in prison in 2019 at age 75 from natural causes, and the Harrison family was notified of his death, which brought complicated emotions but no real closure. "Ellis dying doesn't bring Emma back," Sarah said when informed, "and he spent 33 years in prison denying what he did and showing no remorse, so his death changes nothing for our family." The case became one of the catalysts for national conversations about sex offender laws and community notification, with Emma's story cited in debates about Megan's Law and other legislation in the 1990s. Emma's grave in Evanston became a place where Sarah visited weekly for 38 years until her own death in 2024, at age 81, and she was buried beside her daughter. Sarah's obituary mentioned that she was survived by her son Josh and predeceased by her daughter Emma, whose murder had transformed Sarah into a tireless advocate for children's safety and victims' rights. The ordinary Saturday in April 1986 that had started with cardboard boxes and sunshine had ended with a family shattered and a community traumatized, proving how quickly normal life can become tragedy. The 15-minute phone call that Sarah had taken became symbolic of how predators exploit brief moments of opportunity, and how even the most careful parents can be victimized by those watching and waiting. Josh continues the Emma Harrison Foundation's work, honoring his sister's memory by supporting families experiencing similar tragedies and funding programs that protect children from predators. He told a documentary filmmaker in 2023 that not a day passes when he doesn't think about Emma and the sister relationship they should have had for decades, but that was stolen after just 6 years. "Emma would be 43 years old now," Josh said. "She might have had a career, a family, children of her own, and I should have been Uncle Josh to her kids, but Martin Ellis took all of that away from her and from all of us." The case stands as a reminder that ordinary days can change families forever, that registered sex offenders pose ongoing threats to communities, and that brief moments of distraction can have catastrophic consequences. Emma's story is taught in law enforcement training about the importance of immediate response to child abductions and how the first hours are critical for investigation and potential rescue, and it demonstrates the ripple effects of violence against children, how one crime destroys not just the victim, but entire families who never fully recover from the loss. The purple butterfly backpack that had been Emma's favorite became a symbol of the case, and replicas were used in child safety education programs to teach children about not talking to strangers. In Evanston, where a 6-year-old once played with cardboard boxes in her front yard before being taken by a monster who lived 3 blocks away, Emma's memory endures through the laws that bear her name and the foundation that honors her legacy. The Harrison family's tragedy proved that evil can exist in quiet suburban neighborhoods, that predators blend into communities, and that protecting children requires constant vigilance and strong laws. And April 12, 1986 remains etched in Evanston's collective memory as the ordinary Saturday that changed one family forever and reminded an entire community that tragedy can strike when least expected. Sarah spent 38 years turning her grief into action, ensuring Emma's death would mean something by protecting other children and supporting families navigating similar nightmares. "Emma's life was short, but her impact has been lasting," Josh said at his mother's funeral. "And while we would give anything to have her back, we take some comfort knowing that the laws and programs created in her name have helped keep other children safe." The story of Emma Harrison reminds us that 6-year-olds should be safe playing in their own front yards, that 15 minutes can change everything, and that ordinary days can become extraordinary tragedies when evil is watching.